Okay, let's talk about constructors. A constructor in C++ is a special member function which is used to initialize some valid values to the data members of an object. It has the same name as that of its class. A constructor is executed automatically whenever an object is created. So if we have a class named A, then the name of the constructor would also be A. Now, constructors come handy in initializing data members of a new object which could otherwise have garbage values initially. So, there are three types of constructors: default constructor, parameterized constructor, and copy constructor. Let's see each of these in detail. First one is default constructor. This constructor has no parameters or no arguments, and we define no constructors in a class. If we define no constructors in a class, the compiler auto generates a default constructor, but it doesn't initialize the members. So this is the syntax for default constructor. As you can see here is the name of the class. If we have class named A, then this will become A followed by curly brackets and then the braces, and inside which we have to write the members we initialized. Now let's take a look at an example. So let's see this block first. So we have a class named values and it has four member variables, one under private and three under public. Now it has a constructor. In this block, we have declared or we have defined the constructor inside the class. So the constructor has same name as that of the class, and it is a default constructor as it has no parameters inside the bracket or it has no arguments. So using default constructor, we have initialized the variables. We can initialize any variables we want. So I have initialized three of these variables 0. Then in the main function, I have declared the objects with names v1 and v2. So we don't need to mention about the default constructor when creating objects. The compiler automatically initializes these values. Now let's see how to declare the default constructor outside the class, for which the syntax is this. Only difference is we have to add the class name again, followed by two colons and then again the class name. So the same here, just we added these two things. So again, there are four member variables, and this time we have declared the default constructor outside the class. You can see the syntax here. And same, I have initialized three of the variables to 0. So this is outside the class and this is inside the class. And in default constructor, we just initialize the variables to arbitrary values of our choice. Now let's check parameterized constructor. This type of constructor takes one or more arguments. Unlike default constructor, the arguments it takes are used to initialize the object. Syntax for parameterized constructor inside the class. So this is the syntax: class name followed by some arguments, and inside which we have to initialize. We generally initialize the variables with these arguments. Let's look at this block. Again, I have taken the class named values with four member variables. And one more important thing is that if we have to declare a parameterized constructor, we surely have to declare the default constructor first. We directly declare the parameterized constructor, then the compiler will give an error. So before defining a parameterized constructor, we have to define a default constructor. So here, just for the sake of simplicity, I have omitted uh, definition of default constructor here. So we have a parameterized constructor named same as that of the class, and it has three arguments: 1, 2, 3. We can take any number of arguments depending on the number of variables we need to initialize. So I've initialized three of the variables, three arguments, and this is the declaration inside the class. Now, if we declare the constructor outside the class, we have this syntax. The only thing differs is we have to add another class, we have to write the name of the class again, followed by 2 colons. Rest thing is the same. So parameterized constructor against a default constructor is useful when we have to initialize the variables to some values, not necessarily arbitrary. Now let's look at the last constructor, last type of constructor, which is copy constructor. A copy constructor initializes an object using another object of the same class. If we do not define our own copy constructor, then the compiler generates a default copy constructor, which will create a shallow copy. And this shallow copy will have many problems, many errors ahead, and it will lead to ambiguity in programs, which we'll see later. So for now, let's look at the syntax for copy constructor inside and outside the class. Inside the class, first have the class name, then followed by the brackets inside which we have to write the name of the class again, followed by the object name. So when we use copy constructor, we have to make sure that we have at least one object, that class. Now again, if we have to define copy constructor, then we have to surely define default constructor like that in parameterized constructor. But if we don't, then we'll get an error. Now outside the class, there's just one difference, that we have to add the name of the class again, followed by 2 colons. Rest is the same. So here what we are doing is that here we have added the name of the class again with an object having different name. So we are initializing the value of that object to the value of our current object. So we can see the same thing here inside the main function. Here we have object 1 and object 2, and please omit this class. This is A and not a class. This is A, object 1, object 2. So I have initialized the object 1 variable val to 6. Now I have to copy the same thing to object 2's variable val. So I can use the copy constructor, and we use this in the following way: just equate it, and the compiler automatically understands that this is the declaration, or we are asking for the copy constructor. So this is all about copy constructor, and we'll see about destructors in the next video. Thank you.